We've seen some poorly optimised Unreal Engine games in the last few years, especially on console, but Ark Survival Ascended, a UE5 remake of 2015's Ark Survival Evolved, might just be the worst to date. The good stuff first though. In summary, Ark Survival Ascended is a ground-up remake of Survival Evolved, a game that originally used Unreal Engine 4. In this transition from UE4 to UE5, developer Studio Wildcard chooses to tap into as many new features, as many cutting-edge rendering techniques in Unreal Engine 5 as possible. And here it is. It's on Xbox Game Pass for Series X and S owners, with a release on PS5 and PC too, while last-gen consoles miss out. It's a true next-generation take on the Ark Survival concept in this sense, and on the surface, there's no denying the game's visual high points. The layout of the default island map is intact from the original, but in comparing both games together, the difference is pretty vast. Most notable is the fact that we have UE5's Nanite deployed to chisel out more fine geometric detail across great range. There are more rocks lining the shores, and more foliage detail across the landscape. It's fuller, denser, more richly detailed, while plant life is now fully interactive to player movement. Next along, Unreal Engine 5's Lumen is used in Ascended as well, a hybrid ray tracing technique that simulates global illumination, plus reflections on water. We also now have a volumetric cloud system in play. We get upgraded dynamic water, improved physics using UE5, an improved third-person camera, and much more. All combined, it's a very feature-rich reimagining of the original game that at times looks spectacular. For context, I'm using the PC version here to show Ark Survival Evolved and Ascended at maximum settings. It's also worth noting that my RTX 4080 here isn't actually handling 4K at max settings smoothly. No problem of course in Survival Evolved on left, it's a 9-year-old game after all, but as for Ascended on right, at 4K resolution and all settings bumped up to epic, there's simply no chance of 60 FPS. I've had to resort to Ascended's DLSS performance mode in this case, rendering natively at 1080p. And even here, frame rates aren't exactly a locked 60 FPS by any means. The point being, the incredible demands of the game on PC do set the tone somewhat for the situation on console. Ascended on PS5 and Series X make great use of Nanite, Lumen, and volumetric fog. They aren't on par with PC's top settings, as we'll get to, but each console gets a lion's share of the game's best features. That is, with a serious price in frame rate performance. PS5 and Series X each aim for 60 frames per second, but fall very short of the target. Waking up with your newly made character, you'll be greeted with a choppy 30 to 50 FPS range of performance, and with VSync disabled from the off, you also get screen tearing running up and down the display. It's quite a first impression. Before we get into the frame rate testing then, a quick look at how these consoles and PC stack up in comparison. Looking at the consoles first, in a three-way split, we have PS5 and Series X targeting 1440p. If 1440p sounds too good to be true, well, that's because it is. They each use dynamic resolution scaling, with the lower bound figure coming in at 720p on each, or 50% scale. Given that PS5 and Series X are always below their 60 FPS targets though, the practical result is that most of play natively runs at 720p anyway, reconstructed to 1440p. As for Series S on the far right there, the same logic applies. The target is 900p, in this case on Series S, but most of the native pixel counts come in at 450p. Much like, say, Immortals of Avium or Lords of the Fallen in its 60 FPS performance mode, it's simply too much to have all of these features and 60 FPS running in tandem. Once again, with Ark Survival Ascended, we see PS5, Series X, and S leaning quite heavily on these low native resolutions, reconstructed as they are, to find the GPU headroom for UE5's best features. Looking beyond the resolution drop to 450p, Series S's settings also differ. PS5 and Series X are on par overall, with most differences in lighting you might notice boiling down to variances in cloud coverage. As for Series S though, almost every setting is dropped. Firstly, texture quality is lowered, resulting in a huge chop to the detailing underfoot. The imprints in the sand here are removed, leaving us with this bland, soup-like smudge across the shoreline, plus lower quality shadows and ambient occlusion. Swimming ahead, we're also missing other key features. Water ripple physics are dialed back on Series S, while alpha transparencies for splashes are cut out too. You'll also notice screen space reflections, SSR, are used across the water for Series S, whereas PS5 and Series X benefit from Lumen to avoid occlusion artifacts around the character. In a similar vein, Lumen's impact on global illumination is lessened on Series S. In fairness, Lumen GI is still enabled on the 4 teraflop console to a small degree, but the simulated light bounce, the red hue around rocks you might notice, is simply stripped out of the scene on the far right. It's almost invisible by comparison, and reveals the benefit a fully featured Lumen actually has on PS5 and Series X. On the plus side, the draw distances for trees and major geometry are a match. A crucial point given the framework of the world must have some common ground for online play. Then again, the overall density of grass and rock detail is pruned back again on Series S, with more obvious pop-in for these smaller details. Even more glaring is the fact that certain world physics are disabled on Series S too, meaning foliage, for example, no longer animates as we move through a jungle. All round then, Series S is a heavily cut back rendition of Ark Survival Ascended. Adding the PC version into the mix using an R7 5700X machine paired with an RTX 4080 is quite illuminating too. Xbox Series X and PS5 by extension sit comfortably in the middle in terms of quality settings. Inevitably, Series X misses out on PC's top epic preset, where the drop in rock and plant density is clear to see, as is the hit to texture quality. Really, these textures could stand to be dialed up a notch on console, I think. Still, it's great to see some scalability options on PC to truly unleash the best settings if you've the hardware for it. And, to its credit, Series X and PS5 do each push a respectable quality preset for Lumen, Nanite, and volumetric fog. When it comes to Series S though, well, the comparisons aren't exactly flattering. The many cutbacks we're seeing are the result of an aggressive push to claw back a playable frame rate, and in some cases, Series S struggles to even deliver on that promise. Let's jump to performance testing next. Before we start, there's a unique feature in Ark Survival Ascended on PS5, Series X and S, a command console similar to what we have on PC that lets you tweak UE5 settings. Connect a keyboard to your console of choice, hit the tilde key, and a universe of options open up. Given the dire state of the game's frame rate on console by default, at least the developer gives you the tools to fix it yourself. Consider it the DIY approach. You're able to change the internal resolution, for example, by just entering r.setres in the command menu, and then your chosen value. It's even possible to disable visual features like Lumen GI, reflections, and volumetric clouds. In each case, find the command line and enter 0 as the value at the end. Alas, there is a catch here, in that all of your changes reset every time you reboot the game, so it's really not an ideal fix. Still, if nothing else, the command console does solve one glaring problem on PS5, Series X and S: the screen tearing. Enter r.vsync1 and the tear lines are gone. And yes, it's possible to even enable a 30fps cap too, type t.maxfps30, and we're locked at the 30fps line right away. The snag being, as you might notice, is it introduces an unwanted judder from uneven frame pacing. With that in mind, let's see how each console fares in hitting 60fps instead, on the game's default settings with VSync enabled. And then, after that, how we might optimize for each console ourselves for better results. Kicking off, we have Series S. We've got a 900p target here, of course, with 450p as the typical native resolution. We start off in the opening beach area at the 45 FPS mark, though performance often settles at around the 30 to 35 FPS region once we get into more busy, dense jungle areas. At its worst, we even have moments dipping below 30 FPS, and oddly enough, it's looking up at the volumetric clouds that really hits the console hardest. Still, 30 to 40 FPS is the usual readout, which wouldn't be so bad if we had a way to cap at 30 FPS with even frame pacing. Unfortunately, there are more major drops under this as well. Again, I'm using default settings here as intended by the developer, though with VSync enabled as the only user tweak. In my playthrough, I found North Zone 1 of the island dropping to 13 FPS constantly, especially so once night falls and with rainy weather in play. This very hard drop is potentially conditional on weather and time of day, and appears to fix itself after a console reset. Still, these sub 30 FPS drops are something to watch out for, but the general trend on Series S is performance is just above the 30 FPS line. So, how best to fix Series S ourselves? Well, there are two approaches here. Firstly, there's dropping the native resolution until we hit 60 FPS more consistently by entering r.setRes and also r.secondary screen percentage. You're able to lock to any specific target you choose, all of which gives us a rare opportunity to tweak the resolution on console where usually it's fixed in place. I've gone for a spread of targets on Series S in this case. From left to right we have 600p, 720p, the default 900p, and finally 1080p. Of course, the native resolutions for each will typically rest at 50% scale, so long as 60 FPS is out of reach. Hence, we have 300p, 360p, 450p, and 540p labels up top. The sobering reality is, we need to drop Series S to a 600p target, rendering at 300p, and slightly above where the DRS allows it, to keep 60 FPS in view. And even at this figure, in practice, I still noticed drops under 60. For a bit of fun, I also tried pushing the res targets to more ambitious numbers, targets like 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, each one of these reconstructing from a 50% value. And let's just say it's not a goer for Series S in any case. Moving on, the second approach to optimizing for 60 FPS is a little more aggressive. We're sticking it out at the default 900p targets here, 450p native, and instead we drop visual settings. The default settings are on right. In the middle I lose the volumetric clouds, a move that claws back a significant 10 FPS. And finally, to get it over the line to 60 FPS, we remove volumetric clouds again, and also Series S's basic form of dynamic GI as well. In the end, the result isn't flattering, obviously. We're looking at an even more barren, lifeless world than the one handed to us by default on Series S. And at this point, with so many features stripped out, the benefits of playing Ark Survival Ascended over the 2015 original are limited. Overall, it's clear that the fundamental world design, the complexity of the island Studio Wildcard has built, just doesn't scale elegantly to Series S in any scenario. Switching over to Xbox Series X, at least we're closer to the 60 FPS mark right away. Again, we have a lower bounds and typical reading of 720p reconstructed to 1440p. And starting at this beach area, we have a similar frame rate reading to Series S at around 45 FPS, though on average, Series X often operates at around the 30 to 45 FPS range overall. We also inevitably have moments that drop below that, notably busy jungle areas taking us into the 30s and high 20s. So, there's a huge range here. This is all stock default settings laid out by Studio Wildcard, with the exception being the added VSync, but either way, Series X is just nowhere near the target. There are some spectacular views across the island, especially with UE5's Lumen GI and the heavily detailed sprawls of jungle, but when frame rates are blighted by sub 30 drops and even traversal hitches, it's far from optimal. To cut to the chase then, here's my optimised Series X tests. This time, my resolution targets go from 720p, 900p, 1080p, and then finally the default 1440p, with the actual native pixel counts up top. And the result, 900p, will get you over the line here. Certainly, it's a step down from the 1440p target. Running at 720p native, we get out of the box on Series X. Image quality suffers. For perspective, here's what Series X looks like targeting much higher values as well. Ultimately though, none of these resolution targets are viable if you want a smooth experience. The second approach, of course, to hitting 60fps is to attack the settings themselves. Much like our Series S test earlier, the most effective ways to free up performance is in removing the volumetric clouds and GI. No surprises here, removing both will get you to 60fps, but it's quite a visual sacrifice to make. Finally, we have PS5. Initial impressions are that PS5 runs at a lower frame rate average overall compared to Series X. In fact, at times, it's even 5 to 10 FPS lower, though with matching Lumen GI, reflections, textures, and world detail. For example, this first spawn point at the beach puts us at 33 FPS on PS5, against the 44 FPS reading on Series X. Really, it's not clear why there's a gulf in performance just around this beach area, given resolution readings are the same too. In taxing jungle areas at least, PS5 does behave similarly to Series X though. We're getting performance in the 25 to 40 FPS range and with the odd traversal hitch in view. The result is that PS5 spends more time dwelling around the 30 FPS line, where the Xbox equivalent is able to push closer to the mid-40s. Ultimately, it means a bigger uphill struggle to optimize for PS5 ourselves using console commands. Still, I went through the exact same motions as Series X. The resolution targets go from 720p, 900p, 1080p, and 1440p here, each of course scaling from native values at 50%. Sadly, and unlike Series X, none of these are able to get PS5 to a perfectly stable 60fps reading. Even rendering natively at 360p doesn't quite do the job. It hovers at 58fps, and dropping to resolution figures below that shows diminishing returns. Simply put, it's a struggle to get PS5 to run at 60fps by changing resolution alone, though at least we get a workable range for VRR if your display supports it. For posterity, here's what happens with the next class in target resolutions, going up to 4K. None of these are viable at 60fps on PS5 of course, though interestingly, picking 4K as a target, 1080p native, gets us to a similar 28fps reading as Series X. The final test then is the visual settings change. I've gone for deeper cutbacks on PS5 this time, removing shadows as well on the far left as a kind of extreme last-ditch measure. Running on PS5's default 1440p target, losing shadows, GI, and volumetric clouds gets you close to 60fps, but it's still not over the line. Again, it's hard to truly recommend playing this way. Ark Survival Ascended's world is heavily stripped back, but combined with a resolution drop, 60fps is just in reach on PS5 this way. It's impossible to call these optimized settings ideal, but the state of Ark Survival Ascended is dire enough to justify extreme measures. Right now, what we really need is a push from the developer to optimize the game properly for PS5, Series X and S using tools more advanced than what we have. The command console only takes us so far. Its functionality on console is limited, and the options we do have will never truly replace focused development. At a fundamental level, Ark Survival Ascended does impress in how far it leverages Unreal Engine 5's features. In recreating Ark Survival Evolved from scratch with Lumen, Nanite, and volumetric fog, it's an ambitious effort. But when performance runs from 20 to 40 FPS and with heavy screen tearing to boot, It's clear that the game is not made with a PS5, Series X or S in focus for optimization. It simply exists on each platform, with varying degrees of cutbacks visually from PC. The best I can say of it is that the game does run, but if 60 FPS is the goal, Ascended is a game waiting for new, better console hardware to arrive. But that's all from me today. If you did find this video useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.